I think the industry becoming a lot more established, right? So in the past, it's just a few years. It's still a very young industry. Generally, the entire concept of Bitcoin, right, mining, people possibly are now a bit more familiar with it. Which, okay, now it's not some completely abstract. There is someone who is like with a pickaxe mining on the computer. I don't know. But I think now it's a bit more kind of, okay, there is data centers. There is generally a very high expected demand for power usage of overall kind of the entire computing infrastructure.
Alexander, thank you very much for joining me. How are you doing?
Thank you, Tron, for inviting me. I'm doing very well, and I really appreciate you having me on your podcast.
Amazing. And thank you so much for coming on. And a little bit of context. You've just released the Cambridge Digital Mining Industry Report by the Cambridge Centre for Alternative Finance. And I believe you were the principal researcher and lead author on this. Is that correct?
Yes, exactly. So I'm the Centre for Alternative Finance. This is basically where I'm working. And we are part of Cambridge Church Business School. And our center is quite a long time interested in this topic. Mostly the center is concerned with regulations, supervision, and working closely with those stakeholders. But I think it was about in 2016, 2017 when the center started exploring specifically this crypto asset space more generally. But then I think very quickly there were topics that crystallized out in terms of public conversation, right? Well, what people find interesting, etc. And I think we are also mostly, I guess, known for our electricity consumption index. We worked together with mining pools in the past, so we are, I think, have a history of working generally with industry stakeholders. And I think this report specifically is the culmination of kind of really leveraging our access to industry, but also kind of a bit of our academic network to try to create something where we can bridge the gap between, let's say, practice and academia, right? Because I think that was one of those things that are currently a bit missing, and this is kind of the gap we're trying to fill with this report, and hopefully we can continue doing so, providing really the information that is necessary for everyone to have this kind of evidence-based public dialogue.
Amazing. It is. So you released the report this week, and it is, I was saying to you before, it is a monster of a report. It is huge, and it's just packed with such like nuggets of gold, or Bitcoin, if you want to say that. And yeah, it's so great to see, especially coming from such a credible source, which is quite nice. And so my first question is, how long did it take to put this together? Huge congrats off the back of it, of actually pulling this together. But how long did it take you and the team working on this?
Yeah, so we actually just released yesterday, so everything is very new, and really glad that now finally we were able to publish the results. And just a couple of words. So basically, I think the goal for the first report was really to also provide an introduction, right, to the topic. So not just jumping right into, okay, these are the facts, right, explaining a bit the kind of things we found based on kind of the survey results, but also providing, let's say, an audience that might not be perfectly familiar with Bitcoin or mining specifically. This comes a bit from me talking with stakeholders who might not be perfectly familiar with exactly how a bit of the industry is actually working, right? There's a lot of electricity consumption, there are attributable emissions, but how does actually everything work, right? So the beginning is really to enable those in a I would still call it very concise manner. As you know, it's a very large area, and you can write a book about, multiple books most likely, about each and every part that is in the report, but condensing it in a way that is accessible to really a wide audience, and then having as a next step this granular information that we directly sourced from industry stakeholders. And in total, I think I started with pestering people to participate in my survey around June last year, but obviously that was a long time getting this started. And really, I want to give a shout out to the Bitcoin Mining Council team I'm in touch with, I think some of the kind of key individuals there since quite a long time, and we were kind of discussing, okay, how can we in the past they did a survey, right? They did something very similar, but then how can we in a way possibly have some sort of collaboration where we can create something that we can publish, because we need to be, as you have seen, most likely a bit more granular, right, in terms of like the question, the amount of questions we ask, how we ask questions, but also having the BMC essentially helping us to connect directly with the industry stakeholders, because essentially that's the foundation of any of such a report that is based on primary data. And these conversations were going on for quite a long time, but then really by early kind of like Q1, early Q2, this really formalized. And so then figuring out what kind of survey questions. And in total, to getting back to your question, in total, I would say about a year that it takes, really from the start, from survey questionnaire to finally the publication.
Yeah. One of the big things to come out of this, and I'm sure the headline for a lot of people, is that the sustainable energy mix is now estimated to be around 52%. And comparing that to 2022, where it was reported at 37.6%, I believe. Can you dig into this a little bit of like, what are some of the biggest reasons behind, because this is a big jump.
Yeah. So absolutely. And I would say for this specific kind of large shift, it's the apparent reason is the kind of shift from China, right? That was kind of the exodus after the clampdown on money activity, and then you had it's still a bit a question of how much money activity is still in China, right? It's still a bit of a topic that is being discussed. It's very hard to get evidence on that, I guess. But definitely we saw this move away from China. Then you have adjacent countries, like we saw a lot of movement into, first of all, in our last report, there was still a fair amount of China. We saw a lot of movement to Kazakhstan. And when you look at the specific electricity mix on a country level of for instance, Kazakhstan and China, then you will see that it's still highly fossil fuel based, and that naturally impacted quite significantly our old estimates. And basically, what we're seeing now is specifically much less share in China. Also, Kazakhstan has changed a lot, right? So a lot of shifted possibly to other countries. We saw in our current report shift to, and this is the thing generally when we look into the map we created, right? This is not, possibly we'll speak about this later, but I think the map is more not so much about specific percentages, but more kind of about trends. And the trends that we saw was the US gaining in share. We saw a movement towards South America. Specifically, we have Paraguay and other countries, and those countries are predominantly like renewable, right? Even the national grid mix is pretty much renewable. And those kind of geographical shifts definitely played the major part in kind of the new estimate in that regard.
Yeah, I'm definitely going to dig into that in a little bit, because that was also a big side of this report. Keeping on this line of thinking, that so the difference between this report and previous is that you surveyed mining companies, and that represented, was it 48% of the Bitcoin network's hash rate, which is massive.
Yeah,
that is huge. Like, so fair play for managing to survey that sheer amount. But from your perspective, do you feel that this sample size is representative of the wider Bitcoin mining industry or today?
Yeah, it's a very good question. So also definitely, I really appreciate the contributions of the companies themselves, right? Because you need to dedicate time and you need to have the willingness to actually contribute to the project. So it was really a shout out to those who participated, because that essentially built the foundation of the report. It was 48%. But what I want to say here, and going a bit back to a point I made earlier, what we saw is very large engagement from the US-based companies, and that naturally kind of is reflected also when you look, for instance, at this specific map we created, and I would say is representative, not in terms of possibly geographical. As I said, I would more look at the map in terms of trends. For instance, the US is really has established itself, solidified its position as the major mining hub. It's still a big. I mean, I need to be fair, right? I highly doubt it is 75.4%. But what we want to see here, but the other estimates that range around like a bit less than 40. There are a bit of sometimes estimates out there, so it's I think very hard to pinpoint exactly. But what all these different estimates show is by any doubt the US is a major player, right? So as a key headline story, others are, but this definitely has influence in terms of the geographic distribution of mining activity. Otherwise, I mean, mining is a very competitive business. So the other, for instance, electricity costs and these sort of things, they are kind of standardized, right? Because as soon as you pay too much, I mean, we are, I'm not quite, I think you are possibly located in England or generally the UK or Scotland. And I just know what I'm paying for my kilowatt hour, and there is no way there is going to be any mining, at least not as it is now, right, on the grid at least. There might be like interesting opportunities, but it's a very competitive business. So in these kind of terms, I don't see, I see it's quite representative, but I would not necessarily see the map we created as representative. And you can also see when we, not just in terms of the operational map, but also when we look into where the jurisdictions, where the headquarters are located, and they're close to 50% when the US, right? So that's definitely something to consider. And I have already received some responses about the 75%. So what I want to say here is really, I think the key story is the US is a very big mining hub, but don't get bogged down specifically to these figures because it's a survey, right? It's very hard to get people to contribute, and then you have companies like in the US where they might have more willingness to contribute, and I think a big task. And I hope possibly more from communities in other countries might participate in the next survey, because that's definitely something we want to do. If we get a bit of a larger global penetration in terms of contributing companies, that would definitely help to create also in that specific case, when it comes to the global distribution of mining activity, a bit more of a realistic, in a sense, picture.
Yeah, and you also cited in the report that miners, their top worries, and this might add into that point, is their top worries are the long-term electricity price and adverse government regulation around where to set up. And you mentioned the UK there, and the UK is definitely not a prime location currently for Bitcoin mining. Do you think this is one of the main reasons why in the UK hash rate is so low or non-existent?
So I think there might be opportunities in the UK, frankly, but that's more about, I think, stranded energy related. So there might be some interesting costs, specifically with excess supply of, let's say, wind energy and these sort of things. So there might be opportunities. I need to be fair, I've not done a very specific study about mining in the UK because, as you said, this is not currently a major mining destination. There is, for instance, also, when we think about landfills and these sort of very, I think, specific use cases that might be interesting for the UK, right? Where you have your own, your own generator next to a landfill, and there might be some very kind of, I think, unique, interesting use cases. But it's very hard to like see large scale activity in the US in the UK, simply because they're overall, but not just the UK. It's generally in the EU. I mean, there's some EU countries where we have a bit of more activity that have a bit more abundant, I would say, access to electricity. But overall, I think it's more kind of generally a kind of EU part of Europe issue where you won't see a lot of mining activity. What you see possibly is very kind of this more niche concepts with waste heat recovery. There is specifically, I think, very interesting in our report as well in Finland, right, where you try to harness simply energy more effectively. and try to find those sort of ways how you can integrate, for instance, in the local energy system, like for instance in Finland, where you supply the district heating. That may be helpful. But yeah, facilities that we see in the US that are, at hundreds of megawatt hours and hundreds of megawatts and even gigawatt scale. It's very hard to imagine something like this in the UK, but also generally kind of like in the EU area.
Yeah. Yeah, because you mentioned that's because this is the bit of mining that I love and I'm trying to promote, advocate in the UK is the trends that you identified. So the flaring of gas, the wasted heat recovery, and the demand side response. How much traction did you see from this report around that? Because just me on the ground personally, I'm starting to see it a lot more just being in and around the UK, Europe as well, because it is an obvious solution to a problem rather than just dumping, as you said, a large scale commercial Bitcoin mining facility somewhere.
Mm. Yeah, I need to admit in terms of the exact, so we just released, right? So we still need to see kind of what are people are interested in, etc. What we already saw specifically, what is sustainable energy mix. We also saw I also got some messages about and saw some conversation about the kind of US share. I think those are the key topics that are being discussed. But I think some people are already drilling into this more kind of nuanced commentary that we put in the report as well, specifically around demand response, but also flare gas mitigation, these sort of things. I do feel that at some point in the report, in the later stage, there will be, I think it's chapter 10, not chapter 9, where it was about kind of long-term sustainability of mining. And this is personally something I find very interesting, because as we go along every halving cycle, right, as it becomes more and more competitive, I think it's still, block subsidy is still kind of sufficient as we see possibly next halving as well. But as we go along, right, this either Bitcoin rises drastically and hash rate is still kind of staying to some extent stable, or is much less increasing, and miners will need to find ways that allow the operations to kind of continue sustainably, where possibly transaction fees catching up as well, no one knows, right?
Yeah.
But we see this very volatile, and this will be quite interesting to see kind of so I think it might be at some point a necessity where companies need to look into much more creative solutions. For instance, really, utilizing oversupply of electricity during certain times, right, where you have possibly a bit of a low capex operation where you don't have the next newest generation models, but some bit of like previous generation models, which a lot less capex, and you run them like at, I don't know, like 40% uptime. And these sort of things where the same then goes for specifically, yeah. I believe this will be one of those things that we're going to see. I mean, I don't know, but this is kind of my expectation that kind of the constant decrease, a constant kind of increasing competitiveness of the environment leads just companies to need to be a bit more creative in how they mine.
Yeah, you mentioned in the report how companies are already diversifying. Can you go into a little bit of detail about what you saw companies, how they're diversifying a little bit away from this?
Yes, so this is a very interesting topic. So basically, we saw one of these questions looked into the current that at that point the snapshot was June last year. So we saw, for instance, specifically the big topic is I think AI HPC, but what we saw was kind of limited activity there. It was, I think, in terms of total power allocation, it was 50 basis points. So it was not significant. It was not like really significant. I mean, there's obviously an entire story behind in terms of cost, like 1 megawatt of capex for like building AI infrastructure, and possibly even purchasing the GPU. It's entirely different than if we talk about 1 megawatt in Bitcoin mining. So it's a lot smaller share, but still. What we saw then were when asking about the sentiment questions, I think this is quite interesting where to gauge what are kind of strategies, and we saw business diversification as one of those strategies that is being considered kind of like extremely interesting of these companies. So business diversification was definitely something that those companies are actively looking into. And then you just need to look at public kind of release of statements of public companies where you see more and more firms getting people more from the AI HPC side on their board of directors and these sort of things, and already some firms already having been a foot in this kind of space for quite a long time, frankly. But you see more and more exploring it, and this will be quite interesting, possibly for the next report, because then we can see how things change from last year, possibly to this year, in terms of, for instance, power allocation for instance, for building out HPC infrastructure. So it's in this report, it's more, I think, a bit more theoretical because we don't have too much data besides the last power allocation. We had the kind of information from the sentiment side that, okay, we're actively looking into business diversification, and then essentially me a bit exploring theoretically kind of the topic overall, right? Specifically with the very kind of significant incoming demand for these kind of like AI compute services.
Yeah, it's really interesting because I also see that trend, and then I saw it in the report that Bitcoin mining companies diversifying into the likes of AI. And yeah, it's just very interesting to see how they will going forward, how that they will go together. But pulling us back a little bit away from that bit, you mentioned that one of the main drivers of the report was to be more granular and contemporary data. So I use it's the Cambridge Bitcoin, I need to get this right, the Cambridge Bitcoin Electricity Consumption Index.
Yes.
And it's a fantastic tool. And I'll put a link to the show in the show notes for anyone that wants to check it out. But the new data that you've got from this report has come out of this report, will that be getting put into this index and updating this?
Yeah, it's a very good question. So basically, I think one of those issues with a report in general, not just with our report, with any report, is that it's a snapshot from the past. And what we fortunately, what was quite great to see, is that when we use the data we collect from mining firms, and for the specific point in time, like 30th June 2024. And the results we got from there, if we for electricity consumption, if we compare this to our theoretical model, which is daily updated, then we see that those align quite well, right? Even if the methodology is entirely different, right? The one is a survey, the other one is basically a theoretical model. But I think what corroborates our theoretical model is essentially that if you collect primary data, the result is very, very similar. So we definitely in this kind of case, I think the immediate information that a continuous kind of evolving model delivers is very helpful, because you get a daily update essentially. I don't think it will replace it. I think it will complement it. Specifically, I can't give any timelines there because there's a lot of development work, I think, needed as well to get all this information that we have in the report onto the website, right? And then thinking about how, specifically when it comes to emissions, because there I think where we really see the biggest differences, how do we integrate it properly? So it's definitely something we are thinking about, but I cannot give you an exact timeline for this.
Yeah, because it's really interesting. The reason why I say that I use it a lot is it's just a really good digestible way for people to look at Bitcoin, the energy consumption comparisons with. I really like the comparisons with other industries. And the one that I used to use a lot was which is a great, whoever thought of or putting this on there, hat off to them. But the US residential fridge and freezers, electricity,
Fridges, yeah.
because Bitcoin's not too far, doesn't consume too much more than that when you think of it. Because in this report that you've, let me get up the chart just quickly. It'll make it easier for both of us. So on the index at the moment, it says that Bitcoin is 181 terawatt hours per year. And then you've got the fridges is 104 terawatt hours per year. But in your report, this is why I was asking around, will it update, or will this report reflect in the methodology, let's say, of the index? Because the report that's just come out says it's 138 terawatt hours per year, which would bring it a lot closer to that.
Yeah, so essentially the snapshot is the 30th of June last year. So this is kind of where in the report we can't give always the most updated figure. We have to take a snapshot, and that's where the difference comes in, right? Because if I'm also going on the website and I see it's about 175 terawatt hours, but that's yesterday, and so if you look into this historical time series, you can see that it's also in the report where we on the specific date show the kind of estimate of the theoretical model, but then also show the estimate on the specific time, 30th of June, of the kind of based on survey data, and we see it's very closely aligned. So this is kind of a bit of the issue that we will have and we try to integrate on our website, is that the one is basically something that is daily updated, where the other is something that we collect, let's say, once a year, and then you have a specific point in time as a snapshot. So that's definitely something we need to think about. Fortunately for electricity consumption, we see that the estimates are very closely aligned. So I think that current estimates that we have on our websites most likely would reflect something similar, that if we would collect data from miners. But yeah, the issue I think is a lot more when it comes then to translating this into emissions.
Yeah. No, that's brilliant, because I was just trying to think. Trying to think, but it makes sense with having the snapshot and then daily updated, and yeah, okay, brilliant. Thanks for that clarification.
A bit confusing, I know, but that's I think why it's good to have both things. One is basically a snapshot directly sourced from, let's say, industry practitioners, whereas the others is more kind of daily updated theoretical.
Awesome. One of the big things in this report, or new things in this report, was including off-grid mining. And where you found that 26% of all mining happens off-grid, which was really cool from my perspective to see that. Would you be able to just go into a little bit of detail around the difference between off-grid and on-grid, and how big of an addition was this to the overall picture?
Yes, so that's one of these questions we ask because we have the conversations ongoing about kind of miners accessing off-grid energy. So yeah, we actually need to be a bit careful. Where I think what we found was something that most likely to practitioners, they will also tell you that that's most likely the case. Where this 26% is off-grid access, so it's not the 26% of the entire mining is happening off-grid. It's more kind of that of our respondents, 26% essentially have off-grid access, but that also means that they might have on-grid access as well. So it's kind of this hybrid that we have not drilled into this deeper. So I don't know exactly kind of who, for instance, only uses on-grid, who only uses off-grid. I mean, I kind of know, but it didn't put it in the report. But the other question then, what was more interesting is, and that's to your point, if you look into kind of the electricity consumption, what of really the activity can be fully allocated to off-grid, and that's a bit less, right? I have it currently in front of me, it's about 8.1%. So what this tells us is there is more than 1/4 of firms who at least have this hybrid approach, right? Some are fully off-grid, Others, are fully on grid, but some have some sort of in between. But there is definitely, I think, a big uptake of off grid, but still, if we look into kind of like if you allocate electricity consumption as activity, then most of the activity is still kind of powered, if you want to call it like that, by just on grid. But yeah, we see, I think, and this goes back to our previous conversation with this more creative ways to harness energy a bit more effectively, where you, for instance, have the on-grid access, but you might also have off-grid access, for instance, to, let's say there is some sort of solar or wind farm, and during pre-production times, you might have a basically direct connection to this farm, and have some sort of agreement with the operator, and then you can essentially kind of absorb any sort of excess supply that you would have otherwise curtailed, and naturally I guess you get a good deal of that, and it's kind of this win-win situation for the operator of the energy side, but also for you as a miner, where you can, at least for some times during the day or occasionally, can get access to, I guess, a quite most likely heavily discounted electricity rate. So yeah, that's kind of on, and yeah, to explain this a bit more. So basically, when we speak about on-grid, the entire most likely industrial facility is directly kind of connected to the national grid, for instance. Whereas if we speak about off-grid, a good example here is, let's say, a landfill, right? A landfill, you might not have, you might not run your operations then on grid or whatnot. You have your, let's say, you have your landfill, and then you have your, like gas engine, and you might need to have some sort of, maybe most likely you would need to clean the gas a bit as well. So you need to have some sort of infrastructure, but everything is essentially on site. And the electricity you generate, you would not supply to the grid. You would then directly supply to, let's say, some mining containers you have adjacent to the engine, right? So there is no kind of need to have any sort of access to the national grid, for instance. And the same is if you think about the oil and gas fields, where you have with the associated gases, you need to essentially flare those. So you channel kind of these gases into a flare stack, and then they're burned to this kind of stacks that where the fire is coming out essentially. But you can channel it instead of, for instance, into a gas engine, and then the same principle is here as well, where then you just power directly kind of your computing infrastructure without any sort of access to any national grid, anything. You have the engines directly there, and they are supplying electricity to your operations directly.
Do you think we'll see this? I know we touched on this earlier, and it's also in the report as like growing trends. But you personally, like outside of this report, do you think that this is potentially a way forward that we're going to go, of almost like decentralizing the mining? Because I'm seeing, just the reason why I asked this is because I see a lot of people, even on a small scale, putting just heaters in their home that are miners, but then using the wasted heat from the miners to actually pump heat into their house and heat their homes. And we're also seeing, there's a few different things happening, I'll say, in Scotland around Bitcoin mining, because people have come and said that I've got stranded energy and I'm not connected to the grid. I can't connect to the grid for 10 years. There is a ridiculous backlog in the UK. But do you think that this is a trend that will keep on growing as people just realize how effective Bitcoin can be, to, even if they don't understand Bitcoin? When I'm talking to people, it's more a case of, you don't necessarily have to understand it first, because you've got stranded energy. I know how to monetize it. And then that conversation starts, because usually Bitcoin is a blocker for a lot of people, just the word Bitcoin. Although that is changing with reports like this. Going back to my original question, do you think that this will this trend will really grow and decentralize Bitcoin mining network?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question, specifically with this, I would say, at-home applications. I need to be fair, I haven't looked deeply into this and know that there is certain, I guess, companies that offer these specific services, right? Because you cannot just put
I would not advise that.
yeah, some ASIC in your flat. But there are definitely some sort of, I guess, this kind of devices. I need to be fair. I don't know exactly what the solutions for instance, using an ASIC essentially as an electric heater, or but possibly, right? I think it's always a capex question, like how much need people to invest to buy, let's say, this kind of home heating solution with mining Bitcoin versus investing in some traditional system. So I think that would be a crucial question. If it is actually quite interesting from a financial perspective, then the uptake might definitely be kind of growing, right? If there is a real incentive, for instance, to do so. Otherwise, as you said, there might be some individuals who say, well, philosophically, I want to contribute to helping to decentralize kind of the network mining activity in that case specifically. So there might be some people who say, well, even if it's not kind of profitable compared to, let's say, a traditional solution, where over, let's say, I don't know, over 5-7 years, you might end up at par or even a bit kind of in loss. But they say, well, I just want to do my part to help kind of just from a logical standpoint, the network. So yeah, possibly, but it's not really something I have a strong opinion on, but might be definitely. It's more what I'm more interested in specifically, like this kind of I guess large scale, definitely very large scale issues such as gas flaring, where where there's a clear, in a way, kind of, but in many cases synergies, right? But there's kind of this clear synergy because currently, at least economically, it's just a waste, right? It just put channel of gas in a flare sector, just burn it. There's no purpose. And if you can use that, right, this is definitely whether it's Bitcoin mining or some general kind of AI computation infrastructure, even hydrogen production or whatever it is. Everything is essentially better than just burn it. And this is kind of what I'm looking into more. But yeah, definitely, very interesting to observe how those examples you mentioned specifically is kind of the more at-home solutions at the much kind of like smaller scale. If that is something that will develop as well, yeah, I think this is something we see it more than the professional scale, right? Specifically with Finland, where there is, I think, a bit of professional uptake, but possibly we see kind of like in at-home devices also being used. It just came to me. There's a very funny video I saw it, I think, like 3 or 4 years ago, where it was in YouTube, I think in Russia, where some grandma, it was called, I think, Bitcoin babushkas, but I mean, I think it was a S9, running in their houses and kind of heating their house and trying meat. So possibly, yeah, some possibly this still exists, right? But obviously, this is not something I think anyone would want an ASIC. She had a cat as well, and the cat was really, you could see the cat was really disturbed by the device. But yeah, I mean, people are creative, right? So this might be an extreme example, but there are obviously currently a lot more sophisticated solutions out there, and yeah, people might take those up.
Yeah, it's really interesting to see. As you said, there are creative solutions, and I think that's the advantage that the UK currently has, is people are having to think of creative solutions to actually mining. So, like, I know people that are using the heat from fairly large scale operations. Well, fairly large scale, not commercial or anything, to heat multiple different properties. And also with stranded energy in Scotland, like that's a big problem. Okay, next, let's move on from that. So doing this whole report, was there any findings that just generally surprised you or contradicted what you thought, and you're like, oh wow, okay, I didn't really realize that?
I need to admit, I think most of the things were kind of expected, frankly. With the energy mix, it was clear that specifically if you had the movement away from China, from Kazakhstan, who had a grid that were like highly fossil fuel based, specifically Kazakhstan, and that you see some sort of impact this has on the energy mix, right? That most likely you will receive as a result, even just based on this sheer like reallocation from those kind of two countries. Otherwise, I think efficiency is also something that I think everyone expects to improve over time as miners essentially turn over their hardware units. I need to admit I was possibly one of those things actually that might that I found quite interesting were the off-grid actually. Off-grid specifically kind of seeing that still a quarter at least has access. So it shows that there is definitely uptake. It just didn't like one-to-one translate into activity. But another point was possibly the extent of already firms essentially utilizing flared natural gas, otherwise flared natural gas, where I think pretty much I'm not quite sure for the first time, but I think this is one of the where we have clear empirical evidence of kind of the scale, because the discussion about this specific topic happened happened a lot, but I think what we managed to do in this report is putting a face to the name and say, hey, well, that is kind of what we expect currently, and then running some numbers, doing a scenario analysis of first of all, if we say it's net neutral, right, and there is no additional kind of benefit by whether you use a gas engine or whether you use a flare stack. If we just say, well, it's going to be wasted anyway, so we it's kind of net neutral. But then if there is research where stating specifically about the combustion efficiencies of flare stack and that they are in many cases a lot lower than usually assumed. And if you then look into, for instance, the combustion efficiencies of gas engines that are in many cases, at least the specific example we choose was the one from Crusoe, a lot more kind of efficient in combusting. Then there might be an actual kind of benefit, right, in terms of mitigating emissions by just having just releasing the methane kind of release content, and then but it's very in this kind of conversation. It's as you see possibly then in the report as well. I mean, you see it there, but if you look at the figure, it very much depends on the assumptions, and I think this is why the scenario analysis where the figure you get in the end very much depends into kind of what you assume in terms of flare stack efficiencies. Flare stack efficiency also kind of like, do you use a GBP 100 or 20, and it makes a huge difference, right? So you have, but at least what I think what we are showing here is some kind of idea of like from to the same what we do currently on our website as well, with electricity consumption emissions, where we have this kind of like upper and lower bounds, just to give people an idea. Okay, this is kind of where we are. So I think these were those things that were possibly a bit surprising. Otherwise, I need to admit, kind of things. If you look into this industry for a long time, those things are kind of known. And this is, I guess, something that we also have seen where people say, well, you have published a report, but that's now in a way I would not call it official, but many of those things have been known for quite some time. But ultimately, the way how we need to operate, we really need to find kind of the evidence and then base our work on the evidence, and not kind of what even if it's the reality, right? But we need to have some sort of like strong foundation if we publish something. And that's so much to your question. So nothing that were extraordinary, surprising to me, frankly.
Yeah, but I think that's a really important point. Is you've done the work behind it, because a lot of people within Bitcoin understand these aspects of it, but actually doing the work and having the data to prove it is really important for people outside of Bitcoin. And that's what I really like about this report, because I think you mentioned somewhere I've seen about like policy and changing policy, and getting policymakers to also understand this. And that's where a report like this really helps, because you've done the work. It comes in a format that they're used to as well. It's not just a post on X. And I think that's really important. Was that a goal or an aim, is to have this report so then policymakers, whoever it is, can actually go through this and digest it?
Yeah, so I think we need to speak. It was not specifically designed for like policymakers and those audience, but it was generally for all stakeholders, right? And this is kind of the way how we operate, where you need to take the time, collect all this kind of data, right? And you need to speak with all those, and you need to get all these stakeholders engaged. And I think this is really kind of this is really the difficulty, right? Because we just can't like put some numbers. For all that we do, we need to have the evidence, and specifically getting very large miners to participate is I think quite. And this is where we, I guess, are in a very good position, because we have a bit of history and also I would say established network to a lot of industry stakeholders or people. It's a very close industry, right? So you have some people who help you with the connections, and so we are. And in this case, we were able to get a lot of people on board to provide us the data we then can use to create this report, right? And to really create a report, as you said, in a format that is usually done for instance, like industry analysis, and those sort of kind of assessments. But yeah, that's essentially. There was not a specific stakeholder in mind, but generally what we wanted to do was creating a thematic industry report in a format that is kind of usually how you would conduct some sort of industry assessment or any other of those things, grounded really in the evidence that you need for a lot of stakeholders to, as you said, possibly look into a bit more deeper, right? Not just kind of some anecdotal evidence or some kind of a personal knowledge or whatnot, but actually, okay, these are the results. There's an entire methodology section. This is the methodology. These are the results. Feel free to use it. Don't use it, but at least you are. And this goes to what we have on our website as well. It's kind of transparency, right? So there is no questions about how we get the data. Everything is transparent, so everyone knows exactly how the figures essentially came together, and that is, I think, really important.
Yeah, and I was saying just before we jumped on this call that I'm getting a little bit closer to setting up, hopefully, expert reference group within the Scottish Government around attracting Bitcoin, the Bitcoin industry to Scotland, and energy is one aspect of that. And this report it feels like over the last few years that the narrative on Bitcoin has changed, because a lot more reports, seen as credible players coming into the scene. And do you think that the narrative around, sorry, this question is really like going all over the place, but the end question is, do you think the narrative is changing around Bitcoin is bad for the environment? Because this has typically been a blocker for a lot of people just even looking into Bitcoin.
So I think what I've seen is the kind of discussions. The discussion became a lot less, I would say, charged. So in the specifically 2021, and in this kind of time, we saw a lot of kind of news around this topic. I think this has quite changed. At least currently, you see possibly one occasion or the other, some sort of news article about this. But this was pretty much in 2021. This was kind of nearly, you would say, really dated that there was something about this. In terms of whether the narrative change, I think the industry becoming a lot more established, right? So in the past, it's just a few years. It's still a very young industry. It might have generally the entire concept of Bitcoin, right? Mining people possibly are now a bit more familiar with it. Which, okay, now it's not some completely abstract. There is someone who is like with a pickaxe mining on their computer. I don't know. But I think now it's a bit more kind of, okay, there is data centers, there is generally a very high expected demand for, power usage of overall kind of the entire computing infrastructure. Bitcoin mining or mining up, generally call it digital mining because it's a bit more like comprehensive, right? Even though in our survey it's pretty much like 89, 98% Bitcoin. But I think people understand it now a bit more, kind of how it works, and that might help to already make things a bit more tangible and possibly saying that essentially it's pretty much a data center. I mean, it looks different, right? Data center are a bit more kind of comprehensive if we think tier 3, tier 4, etc. But I think people understand it a bit more, which helps to kind of make the entire topic a bit less charged. It's very otherwise. We have not done an investor survey about how they feel. But what we I think seeing now as well, and they have not done it. So this is my personal opinion, my personal perception, that also that kind of landscape chip, but also I mean specifically on the US, that the political landscape that was pretty much a 180. And in the EU, it's more kind of in terms of they take it, sustainability, etc. They do have with MiCA rules in place that make sure that there is reporting. So that's definitely, I think, in terms of the concern that specifically around ESG is still much more prominent in the EU. But but overall, when we look at investors, I think many, and when we just so recently, right, some I forgot the names, but there was like Cantor, and there were a couple of companies that get together. And you see more kind of established institutions also building digital asset, departments and getting more involved in the space, which might generally help to, get everyone more familiar, right? I would say make it more I think institutionalization is a good word for it. And this might help also shift the debate, for instance, from the environment to other topics, specifically now energy, but also possibly not necessarily Bitcoin related, but more general digital asset strategies. Specifically when it comes to other topics as well. We see public institutions like the BIS, they're doing a lot of experimentations, specifically around wholesale CBDCs and these sort of things. So I think that the entire sector becomes just more kind of graspable to the average Joe, let's say, and this might help to kind of get the emotion a bit out of the debate. But yeah, that's pretty much my own opinion, right? So I said I don't have any kind of data to back this up. That's kind of my perception.
Yeah, it's very similar to mine as well. Well, yeah, for everyone listening, I will put the report in the description below. I would highly recommend anyone going through it because there's so many charts, graphics in there as well. Like even putting those together must have been time consuming, I can imagine.
Yeah, yes, it was generally quite a it was generally quite a large effort by that, but I think in the end the outcome is something that is useful and hopefully it's also helpful from an educational perspective first, but also providing some contemporary insights. One comment from my end: so if you listen to this podcast and you're a Bitcoin miner, please, and you look at the report, please, you look at the QR code and register for the next survey, because as said in the beginning, we are like fully reliant on providing the best data, right? For that we need just participants, and yeah, just feel free to register. I would really appreciate it.
Awesome. Well, yeah, thank you again for coming on the podcast, talking to me about it. As I said, there's so much in there that I had to just pick and choose which bits I was going to ask you about. So I would highly recommend anyone going and having a look at it. And yeah, thank you for coming on and spending an hour with me.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. Yeah, definitely. If there are any questions, right, whether for yourself or anyone listening to this podcast, just feel free to reach out. Always happy to have a chat.
Perfect. And I'll put your contact details below as well if anyone's got more questions.